Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of the Wagner Students for Criminal Justice Reform podcast. I'm your host, Thurston Powers, and today with me is Tyler Prochazka, the features editor at the Basic Income Earth Network. Thank you for joining us, Tyler.
How you doing?
Good. So you're joining us from Taiwan, right?
Yeah, I'm currently at National Zhengzhou University in Taipei, Taiwan.
Very cool. So what's your sort of experience kind of working with basic income?
So I started at the Basic Income Earth Network back in the summer of 2014 or 2015, actually. And I started out just as a regular news editor, and then I kind of worked my way into becoming a features editor, which means that I work with a lot of different people from around the world. I get to interview activists and scholars and economists, and see a lot of different perspectives on the universal basic income concept, some of which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's always really interesting to see all the different points of view that sort of come behind that. And now I'm here in Taiwan, and I'm working with the Basic Income organization here in Taipei. And we're currently planning a conference for next March where we're going to try to bring together some scholars from around the Asia Pacific to talk about the prospects for East Asian countries implementing a universal basic income of their own. So that's sort of my background in the basic income movement.
Now, on a previous episode, we mentioned that throughout the month of December and January, we would be exploring sort of the intersection of crime and economics. And one of the topics that seems to just sort of slip into the debate is the basic income. Like, for example, the Movement for Black Lives platform included a basic income, and that raised some eyebrows. So for those who don't know, what is sort of the general idea behind basic income?
So for the Basic Income Earth Network, we generally propose the idea of an unconditional and universal basic income. What that entails is every citizen, however you want to define that, enjoys an entitlement to a monthly grant of a certain basic level. So that means that you can have enough money to live, including like food and shelter, etc. All of your basic necessities can be taken care of. And there's a lot of nitpicking at the details behind that, but I think that the basic principle of what we're pushing is that it is unconditional, it's universal, and that it is at a level that you can sustain a basic livelihood without having to worry about being thrown on the street if you lose your job.
Now, the first question I usually get when I say, or anyone hears that, is, where does the money come from?
And that's exactly one of the sort of nitpicky parts. Yeah. I mean, it's that is where there's a lot of disagreement, and I think it depends on the context of the country that you're implementing it in, and because, for instance, I mean, I'm a believer in a carbon tax, which a lot of people have very differing views on that. I also think that property taxes, as proposed by Matt Zolinsky, is a legitimate way to sort of redress some of the problems, the historical problems that came about with the granting of property over the years. And I mean, you can have a variety of different taxes that are proposed. Those would be the two main ones that I would look to, because I really don't want to get into income taxes.
Yeah.
I think that would have a distortionary effect on work. Um, Whereas property and sort of these pollution taxes, I think would sort of kill two birds with one stone, in the sense that I think that it's a legitimate way to redress some of the problems that come about from property and pollution, while also funding a basic income in the process.
The income tax question is another one of the ones where, like, for example, whenever I bring this up and I point out that income tax would probably have to go away, people give me a weird look. Um, but that was one of the problems I feel with some of the previous experiments. Like in the 1980s, the Canadians tried Mincome, and they were like, "Oh, well, it decreased labor participation a little bit, and especially among like women with children and teens." But if you look at like the income tax that they were applying, it's just like, well, it's theoretically ambiguous. It's like if you're applying like a 75% income tax to someone, of course they're going to work less. So it might not
Right.
have been the basic income.
Right. I think that, you need to, I think that future experiments need to control for that better. And I think that basic income advocates uh, need to contemplate the distortionary impacts of funding it through an income tax. Because I think one of the best aspects of a basic income is that it generally removes the distortionary impacts of the current welfare state. So there's a huge effective marginal tax rate for people moving out of poverty because they lose all of their welfare benefits. Well, if basic income advocates point this out, but if they then go and replace um, the current, or they fund the basic income with high income taxes, then you have the same problem where you're going to discourage work. So the devil really is in the details at the end of the day. But I do think that most of the empirical evidence now is showing that there really is very little um, effect on labor participation. In fact, some evidence, I think in Namibia, they showed there was an increase in labor participation and intensity. So it, I'm skeptical that in a world with basic income, people will work less. I think that overall, people will be more engaged in society, whether it's in work or civic society, or taking care of their family. These are all things that I think are enabled by basic income that would have a positive effect on economic development.
And what about I imagine it would have a positive impact on entrepreneurship, because one of the
Right.
big concerns about getting started with a business is, what if you fail? Well, society with a basic income, failure isn't quite as sharp. Has there been any research on that?
Yeah, so actually, what I constantly bring up is the Indian basic income trials, where they saw that there was increased business creation and entrepreneurial activity after the implementation of basic income. And I think that that's just really, you don't even need the empirical data to know that that's probably the case when you have this fallback of basic income. You're more likely to go out and start a business because you're less afraid of failure. And I also think that it takes care of some of the issues regarding finding a job that's going to maximize your productivity. Because currently, you might feel pressure to enter the labor market as quickly as possible rather than finding a job that matches your skill set and your interests. So now you have a scenario where you're going into a job that you don't necessarily like, and so your productivity is going to be lower. So I think that in a world with basic income where you're not worried about, you know, entering the labor market as soon as possible, or you're not worried about starting that business, I think that you're going to have people that are a lot more fulfilled in their jobs, but at the same time, I think that has a positive effect on our economic sustainability as well.
Yeah. Charles Murray over at the American Enterprise Institute attempted to go into the details a little bit on one of his own proposals. And, that again, people were like, wait, aren't you at a conservative think tank? Why are you proposing this?
Right.
Um, and his vision of the future labor market to me is both terrifying and also a bit reminiscent of the economically depressed areas around the United States.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how automation will finally reach the point where it destroys more jobs than it produces, which would be a first. Now, normally I would dismiss that out of hand as the ravings of a Luddite, but it's
Right.
Charles Murray.
Right.
So, I mean, he argues that in our lifetime, we will begin to see a situation where more people are looking for work than working, similar to how some of our current inner cities and rural communities are, and that we're going to need a basic income.
Right.
So, yeah, oh, sorry, continue.
So I mean, I think that this time it's different. I think that Marie is right. I think that the pace of change and automation is um, is going to rapidly rework our labor market, and we need to have a backstop that can address the issues that are going to come with automation. Obviously, just like with any new technological change, there's going to be a need for, there's going to be creation of new jobs. But I think Murray is correct in thinking that um, there's going to be a net loss in the long term. And especially think of what happens with international trade. I'm all for free trade, but you do have to consider that for that 40 or 50-year-old who's been in that manufacturing job, it's hard to learn new skills at that stage in their career, and just totally upend their livelihood. So I see that the next new challenge is not really globalization. I think it's automation. And for me as a libertarian, I want to propose the most efficient way and sort of guide the debate before we get into a position where we start making hasty economic decisions. So what I'm proposing is that the most efficient way to deal with that automation is through a basic income rather than restricting automation or restricting the pace of technological development, or a number of other economic interventions that I think will be net worse for our overall quality of life. So at the end of the day, we need to contemplate whether we want to be these ideologues that are going to sort of reject every government intervention whatsoever, or if we want to guide the debate toward the most economically efficient means of, preventing mass disturbances in the economy that I think is going to lead to a lot worse interventions than a basic income. So I think we need to prepare for that now rather than waiting for the automation to disrupt the economy.
So, what are some of the distortionary effects of our current welfare system, and where would they go? Like, what would happen to the current distortions under a basic income?
So, like I mentioned, there's a lot of debate among basic income people. Generally, you see that my impression, talking to a lot of basic income scholars and advocates, is that most recognize that a large portion of the basic income would come from, block granting all of those other welfare programs like, food stamps or housing, what have you, and just putting them into one system and then sending out a check rather than having that huge bureaucracy. But like I said, the devil's in the details. There are some who say, oh, you still need to have this, that, and this, because this particular interest group needs to have this specific type of welfare. But if we take the assumption of the first group, which I think is the majority, and I think in reality that's how it would be implemented, is most welfare programs would be block granted. The positive effect primarily would come from getting rid of all that paternalism and bureaucracy. So we spend billions and billions of dollars just processing these applications and these benefits through food stamps, and we put all these limitations and restrictions on what you can and cannot buy. So for instance, people that receive food stamps, they will try to sell their food stamps illegally on the black market at a loss, because to them, their net, they get a larger utility, they get more benefit from having the cash that they can purchase whatever they need, rather than being restricted to just buying food. So that in and of itself has a distortionary effect where we're forcing people to buy a product that is food that they might not need all of that, but instead they need to pay for a car repair. I mean, I have a friend who's on food stamps and her car broke down, and food stamps doesn't help with changing a tire. So I think that one of the primary benefits is you take away that distortion of the paternalism. We stop assuming that poor people don't know how to spend their money, when in fact that they know their lives better than anyone else, especially a government bureaucrat. And so I think that you would have the economy directing resources more efficiently and more in line with what the market actually wants. And finally, I'll bring up again the effect on work. So we're as Milton Friedman said, we have this system of welfare, and it's not going away. And in an article I wrote called A New Era in Capitalism, I pointed to some psychological studies that show that there are people that are hardwired toward welfare, towards supporting welfare programs, having a government backstop. So we can, as libertarians or conservatives, we can, have the most persuasive arguments, we can have empirical data, and I think that we have that. At the end of the day, there's going to be a group of people that are not going to be persuaded unless we have some sort of government backstop. So with that in mind, with Friedman's assumption that that's not going away, we have to realize that the system that we have in place does discourage people from working. In California, for example, I think the marginal effective tax rate is over 100% for people living at the poverty line. So once you add an hour of work, you actually lose more than an hour's worth of wages because of the huge amount of welfare that you get in California. So obviously, being a rational actor, people are going to choose not to work. And so at the end of the day, we've got to make a choice between again, that ideological rigidity or having a pragmatic system that is going to be a lot more efficient and get rid of that distortionary effects, not only in the billions that we spend on bureaucracy, the paternalism, but also I think, in discouraging a lot of people from participating in civic society and moving up in the marketplace.
Hmm. I definitely agree with all of that. And for those listening, the idea of like a marginal tax exceeding 100%, sometimes that's called the benefits cliff. And
Right.
it's definitely it's a terrible consequence to our welfare system, where you have people who you want to be moving into out of poverty, moving up, and it's like they lose thousands of dollars worth of benefits for
Right.
making like a couple hundred more dollars.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Heritage Foundation did a great piece on the benefits cliff, uh, and I think that as I mean we've created this monstrosity, and uh, we've got to find some way to unwind it. Not, I mean, I didn't even bring up that we have $125 trillion in unfunded liabilities, primarily because I mean that's entitlements there. So we've got to find some system to unwind this. And everybody says, but I think my neighbor is going to stop working. I get that from even people left leaning, or people that I assume were open
Mm.
minded or whatever. Their natural inclination is to think, give them basic income, and then they just randomly have no desire to work. But if you look at, first of all, the empirical data shows that's not true. But in the United States, in polling where they asked, if you had a financial windfall, would you stop working? And the vast majority of Americans said that they would not. And I think that it's just absurd to think that if your basic livelihood is taken care of, that uh, any kind of substantial number of people would stop working or try to move up in the economy if you could afford shelter and food. I think that that's just an absurd notion, and it just flies in the face of empirical data as well.
Now, I think it was about 6 months ago, Cato had this event where they were talking about how different ways of thinking about welfare were triggered by different perceptions of risk. So they were
Mm.
talking about in hunter-gatherer societies, um, hunters tended to engage in more social, communal sharing, whereas gatherers tended to distribute based off of the person's contribution. And the idea was that it hunting involved a lot more luck. Like you send out 5 hunters, maybe one of them comes back with food. You send out 5 gatherers, each gatherer comes back with a little bit of food. And so it triggers in the mind this sort of like, well, yeah, the other 4 hunters didn't come back with food, but that's the nature of hunting.
Right,
We shouldn't just let them starve, and we should
right,
share, because next time, there's a 80% chance that you're not going to come back with food.
right,
And in sort of Charles Murray's future labor market, I think that it probably will be the case that people will be more wired to, if they're not hardwired, but perhaps primed to
right,
support welfare. And so it's like our current welfare system isn't working. So if we try to expand it, like you said, we already can't
right.
fund what we've got. I imagine that it's probably going to result in the sort of collapse we associate with more communist countries. Um, I really do hope that the basic income is a more efficient way, because if people are going to start asking for more welfare, then we got to do it in a way that works, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think that libertarians need to be on the lead on this, rather than getting in these debates about is it or is it not libertarianism? I think that it was libertarians that originated this idea, and I think that it's important to sort of conceptualize society in a different way. I think that the hunter-gatherer component was accurate, and I would also add to that that we benefit from the actions of our ancestors. We benefit from the actions of a collective society around us, and this idea of atomistic um, individualism just isn't true. We do gain benefits from being in society. So the idea that we pay some of that back to make sure that everybody can enjoy the same benefits that we were born into. I think that there is some ethical obligation in that. Again, in my article, I pointed out that there's so many variables that are outside of your control that determine whether or not you're successful. I think it's it's beyond 50%. I think are external variables. What type of household you're born into, what city you're born into, your neighborhood, your friends. A lot of these things that you don't necessarily have that much control over determine your likelihood of success. So for libertarians to say, well, it's each person to themselves. I don't think that has much persuasive value to people, because most people recognize that it's poverty isn't necessarily a condition that is just because you're lazy. I don't think that's true. And even if it is true, it's really just not a very persuasive argument to most people. And that's what I'm trying to change, is that we need a better face on going about and helping people, and just saying, civic society is going to jump in if we eliminate the welfare state. I'm not so convinced of that anymore. I think that civic society has its role, but at the end of the day, the Social Security Administration is actually really efficient at doling out checks. They're the most efficient entitlement, even though they have problems in the way that it's constructed, because they're doling out more than what they're taking in through FICA, but that's a different issue. The actual administration is really, really efficient, more efficient than charities, in fact. So charities have their place in dealing with specific issues, like if you're a drug addict, an alcoholic, or you have an abusive relationship. Those, I think, are the roles of charity. But making sure that you have basic necessities taken care of, having the government as a backstop, I do think is a more efficient means and more effective means at the end of the day than just saying, oh, we'll get rid of all welfare and charity will step in. That's just not persuasive, and I really don't think that is the reality of what would happen.
I think that I agree, and I think that the situation we see in some of the inner cities and deindustrialized Midwest are sort of cases where you've got people suffering horribly.
Right.
The suicide rates and rates of opioid addiction are they're astronomical.
Yep.
And yet there isn't this sort of swell of support. So, I think we do need some form of solution.
Yeah, I do think that we need to start looking at the value of your contribution to society in a different way. Uh,
Hmm.
it you contribute to society in a host of different ways, and we've tied this entirely to a job because you you get a monetary reward for participating in a job. But there are people that contribute to society that don't necessarily receive a monetary or a very large monetary reward. Uh, if you're out there volunteering or you're out there helping people, you're taking care of your children. These are all activities that make society better and that we should value as a society. So for all these people that are hopeless and feel that they're not contributing anything because they're not getting this monetary uh, remuneration, I think that we need to reorient how we view our contribution to society to help stop that trend. Because and I think that the basic income is one step towards doing that. I think that the fact that it's universal and it's unconditional in and of itself removes the stigma that's behind welfare. And so we start removing the stigma associated with, you have to have a job, you have to have high a high salary to prove that you're benefiting society. I think that we need to trigger a rethink about that so that we can stop this onslaught of people whose lives are valuable and that can contribute to society, but they've been beaten down because they've tied all of their value towards their job. So I think that a small part in reorienting that perception could come through something like a basic income.
Now, in terms of stigma, we've also got the problem of sort of the idea of like the ex-convict or the
Right.
accused. Um, what do you think that the impact of a basic income would be on crime, which, as we know, correlates with
Right.
sort of this abject poverty?
Well, I mean, I haven't. If I've seen the data, I don't recall. I don't know if there's been any empirical studies directly on basic income and crime. Obviously, my guess would be that there would be a reduction in crime, but there's so many factors that go into crime. For example, if I'm not mistaken, after the recession of 2009, there was a reduction in crime, which goes against what a lot of people would, assume because people were losing their jobs, etc. So I think there's so many factors that go into crime that it's hard to say, especially without seeing that empirical data. But my uninformed opinion, or I guess somewhat informed opinion, would be that I do think that it would help solve a lot of the issues that I see as correlated with crime. For example, when you have parents that, or especially single parents, that are away from the house all day because they have to work, 12-hour shifts every day just to, make ends meet. I think when the Canadian study showed that single mothers reduce their work hours, I argue that's probably a good thing for society. You want these people, rearing their children, bringing up their children, and when I did some research on crime in Florida, and one of the biggest factors going into crime was the prevalence of single parent households in a county in Florida.
Hmm.
So if you have parents that can be more involved with their children because they don't have to work 12-hour shifts, and they can put food on the table for their kid. They can be a positive influence, and they don't have these. At least their lives will be made more stable by the fact that they have this guaranteed income. That maybe they won't have to leave their house because now they can ensure that they can make rent. So you have more stable lives for a lot of these families. So just uh, again, without any empirical data, I do think that there would be at least a push to towards less crime with a basic income. I can't envision any scenario where it would increase crime. That doesn't follow much.
Yeah, so in Richmond, California, and Washington D.C., they tried this program where they offered basically $1,000 basic, well, not basic income, but sort of like just like a cash stipend to people who were considered high risk of committing future crime, like especially homicide.
Gotcha.
And it was conditional. It was sort of just like, look, stay out of trouble. You get money as long as you're also participating in like the program and services. And they did see a large reduction in crime. But you're right. A lot of the sort of economic studies focus very, very narrowly on sort of like labor participation and
Mm-hmm.
hours worked. So, yeah, I'm very interested in sort of how some of the positive externalities of a basic income that might, I feel, be an angle if you find evidence that would be useful in sort of convincing people. Uh,
Yeah, no, I agree. There was one scholar who was coming up with some ways to implement basic income, and I thought he had an interesting idea of when you graduate high school or college, depending what age you might allow for the basic income to be given to a citizen, 18 or 22 or what have you. You meet with a teacher or a member of the community, and you come up with goals uh, of how you're going to benefit society. And it's part of you're becoming a full citizen, receiving the basic income, and you fill out this contract with your community of what you're going to do. You create an action plan, um, and he said, it shouldn't be mandatory. You shouldn't have to actually do these things, but I think he had some studies of the mere act of making this type of verbal commitment that you're going to be a positive influence on your society, making that action plan does make it more likely that you'll go out and use uh, your grant and the benefits that society has given to you for positive development. And when we look at the case of Alaska, I wrote an article kind of exploring how their very, very minimal basic income, how that affects civic society. And Alaska is ranked as one of the highest in participation rates in the country for civic society. And that doesn't
hmm.
I didn't do any type of regression analysis, so I can't make any kind of causal claims here. But I can at least point out that you know it certainly doesn't harm civic society, as some critics of basic income were claiming. I think that's absolutely absurd. But I think that in theory, it's much more likely to sort of unleash this wave of innovation in civic society, where people are going to be more willing to go out and uh, sort of innovate with making volunteer organizations or what have you. I think I don't remember which economist it was that was critiquing. Oh, who was it? I don't remember. There was an economist in Wall Street Journal who was critiquing basic income. And he said, my daughter went out for 2 years, and she was, looking how she could benefit the world. And because obviously she comes from a wealthy background, so she can do that. And he's like, I don't think that all kids should have the ability to do that. And I thought that was such arrogance, that only people from wealthy backgrounds should be able to go out and explore the world and find the best way that they can contribute to society because they have a guaranteed income from their parents. I think that everybody should be able to enjoy that privilege of not worrying about where your next whether you're going to be able to eat, where your next paycheck is coming from. If you try to go explore the world and go try to make yourself the best person that you can be. I think our society will be a lot better off if everybody gets to have that ability to make the decisions that are best for themselves and not the decisions that are economically necessary at that very moment.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, it was awesome being here.
So, to our audience, thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe. And Tyler, we'd love to have you back on again sometime soon.
Yeah, anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks.